Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, all our web viewers. In this second half of the event, we're going to be talking, first of all, about progress. And I'd like to start with a quote from John Gray's extremely provocative book, Straw Dogs. In the early 19th century, Thomas de Quincey wrote that a quarter of human misery was toothache. He may well have been right. Anesthetic dentistry is an unmixed blessing. So are clean water and flush toilets. Progress is a fact. Even so, faith in progress is a superstition. So I'd like to start by asking my guests, are we fools to believe in progress?
Do you mean evolutionary progress or cultural
in the progress of civilization towards some perfect goal?
Are we better than the dynastic Egyptians?
That kind of thing.
I think we're better. I mean, I think if you look, I don't mean as individuals better, but society, I think that the horrors of the 20th century, like Hitler, are more horrible than the horrors of medieval times, only really in that the technology was available to put the horror into practice on such an enormous scale. And actually, I think as the centuries go by, we are steadily getting nicer in society. We've abolished slavery. We're well on our way to abolishing sexual discrimination, racial discrimination. We haven't succeeded yet, but you don't have to go back very far before it was absolutely taken for granted that people could have slaves. Absolutely taken for granted. What's that rustling? Is it me?
I don't think so. Maybe if you pull the microphone a little bit further away, but I don't think it is you.
It would have been taken for granted that one's own race, whatever one's own race happened to be, was superior to any other. So I think we have made great strides with lamentable steps backwards from time to time. But on the whole, I think the trend is in the right direction.
Oh, I see.
It's him.
Richard, you mentioned the technology that's now available. Would that not enforce John Gray's point that at some point we're going to head for disaster again? The process of progress is not a smooth curve upward. It's very unlikely to be.
Well, the technology is getting better all the time as well, of course, and so it's entirely possible that the two sort of might cross in the wrong place. But I thought the thrust of the question was about whether we are, on the whole, better in our fundamental attitudes, and I think things are definitely getting better. Jonathan's got a microphone now, so I hope he'll
No, well, I think there are certain things which have got better, certainly. I think that what has happened over the course of human history is the sort of thing Jack Goody talks about when he talks about the domestication of the savage mind, is that we, because of literacy and because of the fact that we can write things down and therefore have very complicated recursive attitudes to our own thoughts, which were not previously possible in pre-literate societies, we can have extremely sophisticated judgments about the nature of morality itself. Theories of justice have become unbelievably sophisticated in the last 200 years, for example, since the Enlightenment. And that's not as a result of religion, it's simply the result of the inevitable result of literacy, which creates a very elaborate series of forms of moral self-consciousness, which didn't exist in primitive times. It didn't exist perhaps 1,000 years ago. It's become much more complicated. We have very elaborate discussions about the nature of jurisprudence. For example, you look at a book like Herbert Hart, that big biography has just been published of him. Now, Herbert Hart was one of the great professors of jurisprudence at Oxford, who wrote that wonderful book called The Concept of Law. Now, Hart's book on the concept of law has a philosophical sophistication which would have been inconceivable in a pre-literate society. And what I think has happened is what another social philosopher, Michael Tomasello, when he talks about the development of human cognition, talks about the ratcheting effect, that we differ from animals in the fact that our artifacts, both cognitive and mechanical artifacts, ratchet up from one generation to the next. We get better at doing certain things. We also get better at thinking ingeniously, both morally and technically, because of this capacity, which, I mean, you didn't mention one of the most interesting books that Richard wrote, which I found absolutely devastating to me, devastating in the sense that it completely changed my thinking, and that was The Extended Phenotype. You see, I think that the notion of the extended phenotype is absolutely fascinating. People have tended to think, when they use the word phenotype at all, or when they become familiar with it, and Richard explains it, thinks of it as the body. What Richard pointed out was the things that animals make by virtue of the genotype that determines their physical appearance and physiology also determines the artifacts which they make. Beavers go on making beaver dams in exactly the same way that the genes make the beaver. The genes also make the dam. Now, I remember walking through the outback in Australia some years ago, passing huge 8-foot-tall termite nests, and they were all the same. And then I came to the conclusion as I looked at them, I said, if I'd been here 200 million years ago, they would have still been the same. There's no such thing as a Tudor termite's nest. And then I walked into the outskirts of this small town in the northern part of Queensland and walked for a mile from the suburbs into the centre, and the architecture had changed from 1950 on the edge of the town to 1910 in the centre of the town, but I knew that precisely the same species was responsible for both for the suburb and for the centre. Now, if that sort of fantastic evolutionary change, cultural evolutionary change, can take place without an alteration in species, I suspect also that we are morally ingenious in the same way, that there is a ratcheting effect of the intellectual achievements of one generation will alter and lead to the intellectual improvements of the next generation. It is subverted, on the other hand, by certain things which remain the same in us, which we share with our primate ancestors, and which that great Dutch primatologist, what is he called, Richard?
Lorenz, Conrad?
No,
the Dutch one who works in the Yerkes laboratory.
It'll come to me in a moment.
And he's worked with chimps and macaques and capuchin monkeys for years. And when you read about this, you get this very terrifying feeling of all these streams of nastiness, of tenderness, of concern, of alliances and hostilities are in fact antecedents of all that we do, both morally and immorally. That seems to remain the same, but we also have this sophisticated ability to think ingeniously about morals better and better, and even to set up institutions which embody these moral improvements, and then someone kicks them over. I don't think that we are going to get better in the long run. I think that there are unforeseeable futures in which things like Stalinist monstrosities will occur, things like Nazi monstrosities will occur, things like Pol Pot will recur. I mean, the dismal history of human atrociousness in the 20th century, if things are getting that better, it isn't just simply a momentary lapse. It's been going on since the Belgians, for Christ's sake, killed 8 million black people and no one ever talks about it. They got away with murder. That they've never ever been condemned for it. 8 million people were killed in the Congo by these rubber-seeking monsters.
If we are getting better, and I agree with what both of my colleagues have said, but if we are getting better, I think it's because of communication. It's actually because of technology that we create. If we are able to take advantage of the thoughts that have been thought in other cultures, it's because we can now have access to that through the technology. We're undergoing a communications revolution right now that I think is going to profoundly change society, all societies. In some ways it's going to change those societies for the good. In some ways it's going to change those societies for bad. We see both themes now. It might remain up in the air for some time as to what the overall, whether it's going to be an overall plus or a minus during this particular period of human history. But it's the technology that allows us to be better than the dynastic Egyptians.
Norm, you work with fossils on a day-to-day basis, and many of them are of creatures now extinct, of species now extinct. How does that kind of colour your view of human aspirations, of especially our very long-term dreams?
Well, it tends to make you very humble, actually, because we're very recent arrivals on this planet, and many species have great seniority, great success stories. We do, of course. Our lineage goes back. We are all joined up with with all of the other animals in the past in a phylogenetic sense. But as a species, there are species that exist right alongside us that are of far greater antiquity, whose direct lineages have seen far more of Earth history than we have, and I think we should be a bit more humble in the face of biodiversity than we seem to be.
What I think is fascinating about I think as sociologists we've got better. Am I transmitting? No. The communication thing, which you talk
technology.
About. Yeah, yes. Technology. The one thing which seems to recur, over which we seem to have very little control, and we saw it actually in the former Yugoslavia, that we have a country which can be orderly immediately after the Second World War, where very little atrocity tends to occur until the breakup of the Yugoslavian unity after Tito goes. Suddenly, invisible social tectonic plates become apparent, and you get these sort of shifts and undercuttings, and people who had previously lived together closely are now prepared to commit hideous atrocities against one another when they had previously lived amiably. I can remember a documentary appearing on the BBC must have been about 10 years ago, or perhaps more recently. It was a group of people, I think in Bosnia, and they were sitting and talking in their living room, and they were talking about something, and what they were talking about was outrageous aggression down the road. They said it hasn't reached us yet. There were these people sitting and talking, Albanians. I mean, there were Muslims and Christians sitting together having tea, and they say it's down the road about 20 miles. It hasn't reached us yet, as if they were talking about a typhoid epidemic. Mm-hmm. A year later, the documentary unit went back, and the same groups of people who had been talking about the epidemic were now in the epidemic, and they were on opposite sides of the hedge shooting at one another. Mm-hmm. Now, what we seem to have no control over, and I think whatever technical improvements, all this stuff putting us onto the internet, will allow us to be extremely sophisticated about morals and have meta-concepts and meta-meta-concepts about morals, we don't seem to be able to control, and no one has yet conceived of a technique for controlling the capacity to, as it were, treat others, once we see them as other, alien, immigrant, asylum-seeking, or another race from another lot of blood and another lot of earth. We don't seem to have the capacity to control our atrocious sadism when, in fact, social arrangements are disrupted in some way.
But what you've just described, Jonathan, is just like declaring war on another country. And it reminds me of the famous scenes in the First World War when there was the Christmas truce and British and German troops met in no man's land and gave each other drinks and swapped jokes.
Played soccer.
And played soccer, and then went back next day and started shooting each other again. And so it's more general than just the atrocities of a Pol Pot or the Rwandan massacres or the Belgian Congo massacres. It's something that British and German and French and American decent people do to each other, or did to each other once every 20 years or so. throughout much of history. It is a bizarre... it's rather like the army ants that go into two different phases, as though a sort of hormone spreads.
Yeah.
But it's not a hormone. It's a political decision by your country to declare war for some possibly perfectly good reason. But then suddenly, all feelings of conventional decency disappear, and you suddenly turn into a patriotic soldier, and you do your duty by your country. The whole language changes, and we move into war mode. And I bet that's what happened to those characters that you described in the BBC documentary. When they said, it's coming, it's 20 miles away, what they meant was the equivalent of the typhoid epidemic was that whatever the local tribal government decided to declare war at some point on the other tribe.
What was 20 miles away was the need to decide.
Okay,
the need
yes.
to decide as to what group you were part of.
Yes.
But you see, I think the declaration of war is a fairly superficial artifact, and the declarations of war may in fact move tanks around and may actually, as it were, get armies on the move and deal with the sort of, the logistics of moving things around. What actually creates the atrocities is something which will occur whether or not there have been declarations of war. The misbehavior of the Croatians towards, for example, the Serbs during the Second World War, without there being a war of one against another, they behaved badly because the Croatians were Catholics and the Serbs were Orthodox. They tested people in the way they crossed themselves. If they crossed themselves inadvertently in the Eastern way, they were instantly shot or hurled over the edge of a cliff. Difference was what created them. The declaration of war may have formalized the structures of aggression, but the actual, the sense, to use that horrible French term which became so fashionable in universities, alterity, otherness. All that was required was to feel that Orthodox Christians were contemptible and invertebrate, and that Croatian Catholics were excellent and pure. You then dissolve and go to the current thing, and the Serbs are now doing it to the Kosovans, to the Albanians. The Muslims are contemptible and invertebrate to the Serbian to the Serbian Orthodox.
And I think that propensity for violence, that hatred of the other which suddenly gets triggered, is the reason for Gray's scepticism in this quote. I remember reading something written by Thomas Pynchon about 20 years ago. He said that when the R&D curves of genetics, molecular biology and robotics converge, then we're going to see some really interesting things, and some of them will be good and some of them bad. And I think one of the reasons for Gray's scepticism about our futures, about the idea of progress, is that those technologies are going to be so powerful, those propensities of violence are still going to be there. The future looks rather bleak, doesn't it, from Norm's long-term standpoint?
I think it's bleak for all sorts of reasons over which we have no control. I think I was mentioning to this gentleman here and a number of other people this extraordinary book of Christopher Browning's, Ordinary Men. I don't know how many of you have read it. It ought to be read by everyone. It's an extraordinary account that this great historian, Christopher Browning, put together, an account of the people who participated in the Einsatzgruppen and the execution squads, who were charged by the SS with the job of killing the Jews of Eastern Europe before they got the gas chambers going. And they sent them round in Poland and Lithuania and in Western Russia to round up Jews and shoot them, as many as they could. They were told that they would not in any way be penalized if they opted out, and they were not penalized. They were all men of about 40 years old, too old to fight on the Eastern Front, and they were all of them perfectly ordinary. Most of them were quietly sort of Lutheran figures from Hamburg. They were Christians. And within 6 months, they were standing on the edges of graves in woodlands in Lithuania, asking women to strip and then shooting their brains out at 6 inches distance. They are, many of them, now in various jobs, leading perfectly normal lives. At no point was Christopher Brown able to recognize monstrosity. They were simply like us. Circumstances. Now, it's true in a certain sense that what Richard was saying about the declaration of war had created a framework within which this could happen, but it was also, even without the declaration of war, it was being in a place where they were convinced they were shooting invertebrates. They were not like us. And I just think we will always be doing this. I'm sorry to sort of to indicate this future for us all. I have great anxieties about my grandchildren. I'm going to be dead and not see the atrocities which they will, at some time, some place, here, there, or anywhere, will have to face. But we are monsters as well as being paragons. And I think that we don't know why, and we don't know how to organize ourselves properly. We do, as Richard quite rightly said, have this extraordinary record of a sophisticated improvement of moral sensibility, a literature which becomes increasingly sophisticated, which deals with justice, injustice, civil rights, human rights. And all of this rhetoric is completely contemporary with the most monstrous violations of the very standards that we have now come up with.
But the reason that happens, not to make it too simplistic, but the reason why that happens is that good people simply allow it to, don't oppose it, and the only hope, it seems to me, is communicating the fears that you've so eloquently expressed.
But good people have always come up with it. I mean, there are always people who sacrifice themselves. You only have to think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said Hitler must be killed.
But if there were more,
a clergyman. Well,
but if there were more,
yes, I'm saying.
Yes.
But what you're saying, wouldn't it be nice if things were better?
No. What I'm saying is that the ability to communicate, the ability to talk, the ability to reason, the ability to question is something that we're getting better at. If there is a hope, I think it's there.
Well, we are getting better at questioning, but I mean, in spite of what Richard said, that while in fact many institutions which embody the notions, very sophisticated notions of justice and civil rights, are contemporary with the worst possible outrages. I mean, one of the most extraordinary stories is in Samantha Power's book, is the story of this strange and rather sad little man called Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish lawyer who began, not because the Holocaust had happened, he began talking about this in 1925. He tried to get governments to acknowledge the fact that the Turks had killed 2 million Armenians during the First World War. And he could never get anyone to listen to it. He spoke up and spoke up. He then, of course, after the Second World War, began to scurry through the corridors of the newly established United Nations out of Flushing Meadows, and people would run from this little bore who said, you must realize that we have this tendency to commit atrocious, monstrous acts which kill millions of people. He did it again and again and again. He coined the word genocide. And he was regarded as this terrible bore that would buttonhole you in the corridors. There are always people speaking on behalf of virtue, but ultimately these dreadful tectonic plate shifts which cause fundamental disruptions in otherwise unified communities will always break out. I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but I have bad feelings about it.
Let me try
Richard,
and
and
be a
then
little
let's
bit,
see if we've got any questions.
a little bit more optimistic. In the First World War, Rupert Brooke wrote, "Now God be thanked who has matched us with his hour." There was a great feeling that war was somehow glorious. We still have wars, but now we have anti-war demonstrators. We have people, conscientious objectors, get lionized rather than thrown into prison and treated with contempt. In the Second World War, the destruction of Dresden and Coventry and places was treated as part of war, and the people who did it were regarded as heroes. Now we're apologizing for Dresden and Hiroshima. So suppose the hypothesis were right, that really humanity is as a whole getting better at this kind of thing. You wouldn't expect it to be a uniform upward trend. You'd expect there to be pockets of reversal. You'd expect it to happen piecemeal. In bits of the world it would be better than in other bits of the world for the time being, and then it would get better there. And I think you would expect the course of the progress to be somewhat Sisyphean. But nevertheless, I do think we can see a general trend in the right direction. And I think that the reversals, insofar as they may seem to be getting occasionally worse, that may be because the technology for perpetrating the horrors is getting more efficient.
The 700,000 people who were killed in Rwanda were killed without any technological advance
Yes,
of any
well,
sort. It was all done with machetes.
That was
Yes.
it was done with machetes, but it was organized by communications.
Yes. It was all,
Which was technology.
I think that by focusing on the atrocities in the wars, we maybe cloud matters somewhat. Everyday behaviour, the clothes that we wear that are probably made by child labour, slave labour, the everyday lifestyles that we lead that are polluting our atmosphere with carbon dioxide that's probably going to impact the most on the poorest countries in the world. All these everyday things we really can only cure by recognising that we're all humans, and by doing these everyday things we're worsening life for ourselves as well as for everyone else.
But that's right. But I mean, nowadays all intellectuals would support the view that we're all humans. But a couple of hundred years ago,
Yes.
only we were humans, and the others
Everybody else
weren't.
was something else. Yeah.
Another question over here.
Given that culture and history can be viewed as our extended phenotype, do you think it's proper to reconsider how we learn about these things? I mean, about the social sciences, economics, politics. Do you think we can get insights from what we learn in evolutionary biology?
I'm unhappy with calling human culture the extended phenotype. Really, for the reason Jonathan said when he contrasted termite mounds with human architecture. The point about termite mounds is that genes that make termites build termite mounds survive better as a result of the mounds being better mounds. And so they really are adaptations in the same kind of way as termite antennae and termite legs are adaptations. But architects don't propagate more genes as a consequence of building better buildings. And that sounds a frivolous thing to say, but it is precisely why human artifacts and human culture are, at least not in any simple sense, extended phenotypes.
Dr. Miller seems to say that we have this propensity to commit evil. And theories
I don't want the word evil.
well,
used at
okay,
all, yes.
to commit atrocities,
Yes.
as you say. But theories about humanity have two things. We have genes and we have memes, and memes are the unit of ideas. Where do you think the problem lies? Is it a genetic problem, as in there's something in our genes that makes us do these things? Or is it merely an idea that persists and can never be erased from human society, that causes us to do these horrible things?
I have consistently, in some sense, disagreed with Richard about the notion of the meme, or about the cultural evolution, the things that spread, imitation, doing likewise, and so forth, and cultural development, cultural evolution. Well, what I do think is that it seems, from what we can learn from, I wish I could remember this Dutch.
I'm even struggling to remember. It's not Van Hoof. Somebody here must have. Marek, you know what.
He wrote this.
He wrote a book called Chimpanzee Politics.
Chimpanzee Politics.
Does that give it to anyone?
And the most recent one is the one called Good Natured. All about chimpanzee.
I know him very well. I'm going
chimpanzee alliances and so forth. Well, I actually think that we do. I think that because of what Darwin said, we are descendants from the common stock which has produced chimpanzees and us, that there are, in fact, genetically determined propensities to act in variously complicated ways, which we can see analogues of, not identical, but analogues of in chimpanzee behavior, which, when deformed in the unforeseeable social arrangements that we have, which are not, as it were, selected by natural selection, but because we are in some ways independent of it now, to a very large extent, all sorts of unforeseeable tendencies, behavioral tendencies, get magnified and exacerbated under the peculiar conditions that we create for ourselves by being sociable in the way that we are. Monkeys only live in very small troops. We live in, the number of people here is larger than any community of chimpanzees which actually behave badly within. It's already, there are more people listening politely to this discussion than there are in any sort of chimp community. So it's already become a complicated thing by virtue of the fact that we have very, very complicated urban societies and very complicated urban civilizations which conflict with one another, which, as Richard rightly said, declare war on one another. But I think that the declaration of war simply sets in motion all sorts of other things which, in fact, enable us to behave in monstrously atrocious ways. And I do not foresee, I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about it, but I just don't see it ultimately getting better. I don't think these are pockets. I think that Richard is unfair when he calls these pockets of sort of return to the horrors. I think that they are extremely ingenious horrors. Not merely because of the technology. We are also because of the linguistic technology, the rhetorical technology. It's the rhetoric of Nazism, the rhetoric of Stalinism, which actually created the Gulag. It wasn't the monstrous machinery which enabled the Gulag. The Gulag was an extremely primitive device with scarcely any machinery of any important sort at all. What it was an ideology for which there was no precedent. The idea of a millennial improvement of society which merited the death of millions of people with the prospect of some millennial improvement at an infinitely delayed future.
Let's move on just because we're running out of time. I think the name everyone's been looking for is Frans de Waal.
Frans de Waal.
It's been given to me on a bit of paper, but I'm claiming it as part of my extended phenotype. Richard Dawkins, one reason for the phenomenal success of religions, of organised religions, is quite possibly the consolation they provide for both our deaths and for those of our loved ones. Can an evolutionary outlook provide us any consolations in the face of mortality?
If it can't, that says nothing whatsoever about whether it's true. The world is divided into people who simply cannot grasp that simple point, and those who can, who cannot grasp the point that if something is consoling, that doesn't make it true. So maybe it doesn't, and it certainly doesn't offer a hope. I've gone off the air, have I?
No, you're there.
No, you're still there.
It certainly doesn't offer a hope of living after death, which seems to me obviously a preposterous notion. However, I find great consolation in knowing that during the brief time that I have on this planet, I am privileged to be allowed to understand something, actually nowadays rather a lot, about the world in which I've been born, about the life form of which I'm a grateful part. I acknowledge that my time is finite, but I feel hugely privileged to be granted a few decades in the sun during which I can get to grips with understanding why I was ever born in the first place. And I find that consoling is almost too weak a word. I mean, it's exhilarating. I find it an exuberant thought. And the fact that life is finite makes me all the more grateful to have it for the short time that I do.
Norman Macleod.
Yes, I would agree with everything that Richard said. I find evolution is totally out of the question here. Evolution doesn't matter one way or the other with respect to this question. But I think an understanding of evolution sets a context which I personally find quite profound and quite intriguing. And yes, if we all lived forever, then we wouldn't value life, even though we don't seem to value life as much as we should. But not having it, knowing that we're not having it, needs to, and I think it does, inspire all of us in our own ways to make the most of the time that we have.
Mm.
Jonathan, you asked this question of quite a lot of people during your series. It's made more poignant by the recent death of Arthur Miller, who was eloquent on the matter. I mean, do you find that renouncing the comforts of immortality has made the whole process of facing our deaths for all of us much more difficult?
No. I mean, mainly because I simply cannot make sense of the idea of a disembodied existence. It's what philosophers call not wrong. It's logically incoherent, for lots of very interesting philosophical reasons. One is that I actually think that what makes all of us feel that we are individuals and cherish our embodied life as we have it at the moment is that there are all sorts of very complicated pleasures and satisfactions and fears and dreads which define our individuality and define our existence. And it's all to do with having a body. The idea of not having a body and still being identifiable as myself seems to be impossible. I mean, how would it know that it had once been me? As I said, I can jump 18 inches. A thing without a body can't do one or the other. It can't even have what the philosophers call deictic indications. It can't say that it's here rather than there. I'm here rather than there, merely by virtue of the fact that this lump of stuff's here and it's not over there. There are lots of lumps of stuff which are the center of individuality. The idea of continuing to be identifiable either to itself or to others with who expect to meet it later on is idiotic. It simply makes no sense at all. And when you associate it with things like transmigration, which led me to have this sort of scene of Marie Antoinette in the tumbril trying to comfort her maid, sobbing on the way to the guillotine and saying, "It is all right, Fifi. I know that I am going to be Shirley MacLaine, whoever that is." The thing is, there's no room in Shirley MacLaine for Marie Antoinette. Remember, Shirley MacLaine is working flat out at being Shirley MacLaine, and she can't entertain a lodger, and particularly a disembodied lodger that would actually thank Shirley MacLaine for putting her up for a while.
But to be fair to the theory, the whole notion of going to a better place, of getting a reward, is tied up with the idea of a reward.
Yes, but you can't be rewarded if you're not actually
yes,
unembodied.
Yes, but this is what some people require in order to give them hope.
Well, I think there are all sorts of other ways of getting
Oh,
hope.
there are.
Yes, I mean,
It
is rather pathetic that is the way in which people get hope. I think that, in fact, it's a class thing, that the lives of poor people, the people to whom Jesus drew attention and asked them to come unto him, were in fact the people who have no hope whatever, and for whom life is so ghastly, so utterly and unforgivably nasty because of political institutions, that it's only with the promise of some sort of delayed, infinitely delayed
Justice.
future that it makes it work for them. Yes. And fortunately, they have not been introduced to the philosophical incoherence of the fact, and incidentally, dear, I have to tell you, you will be disembodied, but you'll be joyful. It doesn't make sense, but it's a reflection of the monstrous social injustice of the embodied mortal world in which we live, in which politics has screwed up the lives of 90% of the living population of the planet.
Well, I think we are going to have to close shortly. We are running out of time, and we're going to have to haul these lumps of stuff from over here to over there, or else we're going to be in here all night. But anyone who's feeling a bit depressed will be pleased to know that next month's evening event is Who Wants to Live Forever? So we're going to be talking about cryogenics and things like that. Before we go, I'd like to see if there are any questions. We've got time for just a few. This gentleman's been waiting for about an hour.
Hi, thanks. Hi. Sorry, Jonathan Miller, you said that the future looks bleak, that you have bad feelings, you're pessimistic and you feel anxiety. I wondered if in any way, in any small way, you envy those people who are religious and who feel in no way any of these bad feelings.
No, I don't think the future is bleak. What I think is the human condition is bleak and also brilliant. It is this weird sort of zebra-coated thing from which we can't escape by virtue of being these moral zebras that we are, being black and white, in series of stripes. I don't feel that I'm unlucky in not being religious. I just am. Or I don't feel I'm lucky in being it. It just is the way I feel. The universe and our place in it is. I don't think the future is bleak in any sense. It's always been the same. That there will always be these brilliantly sunlit episodes, as there was when everyone thought in that wonderful period in the 19th century, between the Crimean War and the First World War, or at least until the Franco-Prussian War, and then between the Franco-Prussian War and the First World War, there were these long sort of sunlit periods. But the sunlit periods were almost entirely enjoyed by the wealthy. Let everyone remember that. I mean, you get these wonderful sort of Bloomsbury sort of dithyrambs about how wonderful these long autumnal sunsets and Indian summers were. They were for people as comfortably off as the Strachys and the Wolfes and the Bloomsbury group. No one ever talked to the miners who were starving, who had rickets, who had bow legs, and who suffered from 1,000 different sorts of unjust diseases. And one of the reasons why I feel so angry with this government, we've been betrayed into the loss of a humane socialism, that's where our hope lies, is in actually organizing our social arrangements with a bit more intelligence, humor, and sympathy.
Any more questions?
This meeting's been focused on a number of things, including morality and why we should have morality. I noticed that Jonathan Miller mentioned that there really is no such thing as evil per se, and that our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong, has been genetically determined perhaps through our nature and nurture. We have developed this idea of what is beneficial for us as a community. We know what it is good for us to do for our benefit, but why should we do these things? Why should we benefit our nature or our nurture? Why should we benefit our genes? Can one of the panel suggest what it is that Hitler actually did wrong other than to get caught? What is that is what is morally repugnant about Hitler? And why is it that we should not be architects of the monstrosities that Jonathan Miller is talking about?
Hard to know where to begin.
Well, do you mean that there's something arbitrary about, I mean, that one could imagine an alternative morality according to which Hitler was good, and therefore we ought to be able to come up with some objective rationale for why Hitler is bad and Gandhi is good?
Yes, I mean, the implication that Hitler did anything wrong implies there is a morality by which we can judge him to be wrong. Now, is that morality something we have chosen, something we have made up, and is in a sense arbitrary? Or is it something that is absolute? I noticed that you mentioned, Richard Dawkins, about how humanity may be becoming better. By which standard are we becoming better?
Well, I don't think it's absolute. I mean, I don't think there's something called morality hanging out there which is waiting to be discovered. I do think it's built up in just the way Jonathan was talking about, by this sophisticated cultural accumulation of wisdom, which as the centuries go by builds upon the wisdom of previous centuries. And I think it comes from a kind of cognitive thinking about, talking about, reasoning about the kind of society in which we all would like to live. And probably also informed by some kind of Darwinian underpinning, which comes from our remote past as well. Somebody was pointing out anthropologically that things like the Golden Rule are universal. So I don't think I could ever prove that that a statement about morality, that something is good or something else is bad, is true in the same way as I could prove Pythagoras' theorem is true. I don't think it's that kind of thing.
I think there's been a growing development, a growing sensibility that, for example, it is wrong deliberately to cause as much pain as you possibly can deliberately to other people. After all, for years, without there being any sort of notion of civil rights or human rights, people were prepared to stand in the middle of the 18th century, in the 1750s, and see Damien, the attempted assassin of Louis XV, torn apart by horses which seized his limbs and tore them off their sockets, and molten lead to be poured into his mouth, and people to visit it and watch it, and be excited and interested in it in ways that we find completely unbelievable and insufferable. We have developed a very complicated rhetoric of morality vis-à-vis the inflicting of pain, and the notion that we all have a right to be immune from deliberately inflicting pain.
I think there are more. There are no moral absolutes, but certainly on a in a relative sense, the very fact that societies from around the world rose up for their own reasons and eradicated Nazism gives us an indication that that was not an acceptable way of organizing social relations.
But I wish that was the reason why people did it.
So it's not to say it's not to say that they'll always do that.
No, but I don't think they did it in the name of that. You see, I actually think that what happened was the territorial principles really determined it. That this was the invasion of a sovereign state. That he invaded Russia. The Russians actually reacted against the invasion of Russia. Enormous atrocities were committed by the Nazis against the Jews in the 30s, and no one complained about it.
But if that was true, if it was just a territorial thing, then the war would have stopped when Germany was returned to its historical borders.
No,
that wasn't the case.
No, I think that what happened then is that all sorts of other territorial and ideological principles took over, that it became convenient at that time, with the defeat of Germany in hand, for the Russians to try and overtake and establish a communist hegemony over the whole of Western Europe. and they were stopped at what became the Berlin Wall.
I think we really are sadly going to have to end there. Otherwise, we're really going to be stuck here all night. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and for taking part. Thank you very much to our web viewers who are leaving us now. I remind you, please come along to the next one, free wine, and find out about living forever. I'm sure that's as good as advertisement as any. And a big thank you, please, from everybody for Richard Dawkins, Norm Macleod, and Jonathan Miller. Thank you very much.
Extremely sophisticated judgments about the nature of morality itself. Theories of justice have become unbelievably sophisticated in the last 200 years, for example, since the Enlightenment. And that's not as a result of religion, it's simply the result of the inevitable result of literacy, which creates a very elaborate series of forms of moral self-consciousness, which didn't exist in primitive times. It didn't exist perhaps 1,000 years ago. It's become much more complicated. We have very elaborate discussions about the nature of jurisprudence. For example, you look at a book like Herbert Hart, whose big biography has just been published of him. Now, Herbert Hart was one of the great professors of jurisprudence at Oxford, who wrote that wonderful book called The Concept of Law. Now, Hart's book on the concept of law has a philosophical sophistication which would have been inconceivable in a pre-literate society. And what I think has happened is what another social philosopher, Michael Tomasello, when he talks about the development of human cognition, talks about the ratcheting effect, that we differ from animals in the fact that our artifacts, both cognitive and
Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, all our web viewers. In this second half of the event, we're going to be talking, first of all, about progress. And I'd like to start with a quote from John Gray's extremely provocative book, Straw Dogs. In the early 19th century, Thomas de Quincey wrote that a quarter of human misery was toothache. He may well have been right. Anesthetic dentistry is an unmixed blessing. So are clean water and flush toilets. Progress is a fact. Even so, faith in progress is a superstition. So I'd like to start by asking my guests, are we fools to believe in progress?
Do you mean evolutionary progress or cultural
In the progress of civilization towards some perfect goal?
Are we better than the dynastic Egyptians?
That kind of thing.
I think we're better. I mean, I think if you look, I don't mean as individuals better, but society, I think...
It's him.
Richard, you mentioned the technology that's now available. Would that not enforce John Gray's point that at some point we're going to head for disaster again? The process of progress is not a smooth curve upward. It's very unlikely to be.
Well, the technology is getting better all the time as well, of course, and so it's entirely possible that the two sort of might cross in the wrong place. But I thought the thrust of the question was about whether we are, on the whole, better in our fundamental attitudes, and I think things are definitely getting better. Jonathan's got a microphone now, so I hope he'll
No, well, I think there are certain things which have got better, certainly. I think that what has happened over the course of human history is that is the sort of thing the Jack Goody talks about when he talks about the domestication of the savage mind, is that we, because of literacy and because of the fact that we can write things down and therefore have very complicated recursive attitudes to our own thoughts, which were not previously possible in pre-literate societies, we can have mechanical artifacts, ratchet up from one generation to the next. We get better at doing certain things. We also get better at thinking ingeniously, both morally and technically, because of this capacity, which, I mean, you didn't mention one of the most interesting books that Richard wrote, which I found absolutely devastating to me, devastating in the sense that it completely changed my thinking, and that was The Extended Phenotype. You see, I think that the notion of the extended phenotype is absolutely fascinating. People have tended to think, when they use the word phenotype at all, or when they become familiar with it, and Richard explains it, thinks of it as the body. What Richard pointed out was the things that animals make by virtue of the genotype that determines their physical appearance and physiology also determines the artifacts which they make. Beavers go on making beaver dams in exactly the same way that the genes make the beaver. The genes also make the dam. Now, I remember walking through the outback in Australia some years ago, passing huge 8-foot-tall termite nests, and they were all the same. And then I came to the conclusion as I looked at them, I said, if I'd been here 200 million years ago, they would have still been.
The horrors of the 20th century, like Hitler, are more horrible than the horrors of medieval times, only really in that the technology was available to put the horror into practice on such an enormous scale. And actually, I think as the centuries go by, we are steadily getting nicer in society. We've abolished slavery, we're well on our way to abolishing sexual discrimination, racial discrimination. We haven't succeeded yet, but you don't have to go back very far before it was absolutely taken for granted that people could have slaves, absolutely taken for granted. What's that rustling? Is it me?
I don't think so. Maybe if you pull the microphone a little bit further away, but I don't think it is you.
It would have been taken for granted that one's own race, whatever one's own race happened to be, was superior to any other. So I think we have made great strides with lamentable steps backwards from time to time. But on the whole, I think the trend is in the right direction.
Oh, I see.